Your pepper plant is dying, and the bag of fertilizer you bought might be part of the reason. Pale leaves, blossoms dropping off before they ever set fruit. You did everything the label told you to do. And by the end of August, you walk out to the garden and count 6 small peppers on a plant that should be carrying 60. My name is Eli, and I am going to show you the 2-spoon trick that 4 generations of Amish families have used to turn tired, half-dead pepper plants into producers, and the 1957 Ohio State Agricultural Bulletin that explains why your plant is starving even while you feed it every week. 2 spoons. That is the difference. 2 heaping spoons of a plain white crystal that costs about $1.50 at any pharmacy worked into the soil around the base of that struggling plant. And in the right conditions, within about 14 days, the whole thing comes alive like somebody flipped a switch underneath the dirt. The Amish families I sat with in Lancaster County have been doing this for 4 generations. They have a name for it. It has nothing to do with chemistry. It has everything to do with what their grandfathers learned the hard way. And before you worry that this only works if you are starting a brand new garden from scratch, let me promise you right now, this works on the plants you already have in the ground today, even the ones that look half dead. The first time I walked into an Amish produce stand outside of Berlin, Ohio, I stood there for 10 minutes just staring at a wooden crate of bell peppers the size of my fist, wondering what on earth they were feeding the soil. These were not the thin-walled, watery, pale peppers you find shrink-wrapped at the grocery store. These were heavy, dense, the color so deep it looked almost waxed. I picked one up and it had real weight to it, the kind of weight that tells you the plant that grew it was not struggling for anything. The man running the stand watched me turn it over in my hand, and he did not say much, the way those men often do not, but he could see the question on my face. So let me take you back to the kitchen table where I finally got the answer. It was a farmhouse just outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania. Early summer, windows open, a breeze moving the curtains, and a glass jar sitting on the counter filled with what looked like coarse salt. The man sitting across from me was a grandfather with hands like cracked leather, hands that had worked soil for 60 years. He saw me looking at the jar and grinned. He told me that jar had been refilled from the same hardware store in town for 43 years, and that his father had refilled it from the general store in that same town before him. He called it bitter salt. The English world, he said, calls it Epsom salt. And then he told me the story of where it came from, which is the first piece almost nobody ever tells you. Back in 1618, in a little town called Epsom in Surrey, England, a herdsman noticed his cattle refused to drink from one particular spring, even though they were thirsty. He tasted the water himself and found it intensely bitter. When that water evaporated in the sun, it left behind a crust of white crystals. Local people started boiling the spring water down to harvest those crystals, and within a few decades they were being shipped all over Europe as a remedy for sore muscles and aching joints. What nobody understood for almost 200 years was that those crystals were pure magnesium sulfate, and that magnesium happens to be the single most critical mineral inside every green leaf on every plant you have ever seen. Let me explain why, because this is the whole foundation of everything that follows. The green color in a leaf comes from a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the machine that captures sunlight and turns it, along with water and air, into the sugars the plant lives on. It is the engine of the entire plant, and at the very center of every single chlorophyll molecule, holding the whole structure together, sits one atom of magnesium. One. Without that magnesium atom, the molecule collapses and cannot function. No magnesium, no working chlorophyll, no sugar, no energy to build leaves, stems, flowers, or fruit. It is a straight line, and magnesium is the first domino. Without magnesium, the plant cannot make food, and without food, the plant cannot make fruit. It is genuinely that simple, and it is why a magnesium shortage shows up first as pale, yellowing leaves. The plant is literally running low on the one mineral it needs to stay green. Now here is the part that should make you a little angry, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Modern commercial fertilizers, the ones in the big bags with the 3 numbers printed on the front, are almost entirely focused on 3 things: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That is what those 3 numbers mean. NPK, nitrogen for green leafy growth, phosphorus for roots, potassium for general vigor. And those are real, those matter. But magnesium, the one mineral sitting at the center of every chlorophyll molecule in the plant, is treated as an afterthought, a so-called secondary nutrient, and a great many of the cheaper fertilizers on the shelf contain almost none of it at all. Think about what that means. You are buying a product to feed your plant, and the product is missing the single mineral that sits at the heart of the plant's ability to make food in the first place. So you go to the garden center, you buy the bag with the big bold number on the front because the big number feels like more value. You sprinkle it faithfully around your peppers, and then you stand there in August wondering why the lower leaves are turning yellow between the veins while the veins themselves stay stubbornly green, and why the blossoms keep falling off before they ever become a pepper. That yellowing pattern, pale leaf tissue with green veins running through it, has a name. It is called interveinal chlorosis, and it is the textbook visual signature of magnesium deficiency. Once somebody shows it to you, you will see it everywhere, in your own garden and in your neighbors. Washington State University published research out of their Puyallup Extension Center confirming that magnesium deficiency shows up regularly in the intensive growing of peppers, tomatoes, apples, potatoes, watermelon, and more than a dozen other crops grown right across North America. This is not fringe, this is documented, mainstream soil science. The Amish never read that document. They did not need to. They learned it in 1850, they learned it in 1890. They learned it sitting at a table just like the one I was sitting at, watching a grandfather pour 2 level spoonfuls of bitter salt into a watering can and carry it out to the garden without saying a single word, because to him it was as ordinary as putting salt on his potatoes at supper. But I have to be honest with you about something right here, because it matters and because it is the difference between this channel and the people who just want to sell you a bag of something. Epsom salt is not magic, and it is not a cure for every sick plant in every garden. It does one specific thing. It corrects a magnesium and sulfur shortage. If your plant is yellowing between the veins, dropping blossoms, and growing in older soil that has been planted year after year, then a magnesium shortage is very likely what you are looking at, and Epsom salt will help dramatically. But if your soil already has plenty of magnesium, adding more will not give you a bigger harvest, and piling on too much can actually build up salts in the root zone and hurt the plant. So this is not about dumping crystals on everything. It is about feeding the one mineral that is most often missing in the right amount at the right time. Keep that honesty in your head and you will get the result. Ignore it and overdo it and you will be disappointed, and it will not be the method's fault. There was a study run by the National Gardening Association on Epsom salt and peppers, and the result was almost embarrassing in how clear it came out. Most of the home gardeners who treated their peppers with Epsom salt reported plants that were noticeably larger than the untreated control plants. Larger plants, more blossoms, more fruit. By a margin the gardeners could see just walking through the rows, and yet you will not find that study mentioned on the back of a single bag of commercial fertilizer at the big box store. You will not see it advertised. Why? Because Epsom salt costs about $4 for a bag that lasts an entire growing season, and the company that mines it does not have a marketing department lobbying garden magazines. There is no quarterly profit tied to telling you that 2 spoonfuls of a mineral your great-grandmother used to soak her feet in will do more for your pepper harvest than a $50 bag of name-brand plant food. The Amish families I spent time with in Holmes County had a phrase for this. An older woman named Sarah told me, with a small smile, that the English are very good at selling people the answer to a problem they do not have, while ignoring the cheap fix for the problem they actually do have. Her mother fed peppers with bitter salt. Her grandmother fed peppers with bitter salt. The only thing that changed across 4 generations was the size of the bag they bought it in. So let me give you the exact application, because this is the part where most people get it wrong and then convince themselves the whole thing does not work. When you first plant a pepper seedling, dig the hole, and before you set the plant in, drop 1 to 2 tablespoons of Epsom salt into the bottom of the hole. Sprinkle a thin layer of plain soil over it so the roots do not sit directly on the crystals, then set your seedling in and fill around it. That alone gives the plant a magnesium reservoir to draw from for the first 6 weeks of its life. Then, once the plant is established and you see the first blossoms forming, dissolve 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt into 1 gallon of warm water, stir until it is completely dissolved, and use that as a foliar spray directly onto the leaves early in the morning before the sun gets hot. The leaves absorb magnesium right through their surface, which means you bypass the soil entirely and deliver the mineral straight into the green factory where it is needed. Now here is the second piece of the puzzle, and it has to do with sulfur. Epsom salt is not just magnesium, it is magnesium sulfate, which means every spoonful delivers 2 essential minerals at once. Sulfur is what lets the plant build proteins and enzymes. Without sulfur, the magnesium cannot do its job, and without magnesium, the sulfur cannot do its job. They are partners, they work together. And here is the part almost nobody outside agricultural research understands. The acidity of many American garden soils, especially in the eastern half of the country, can lock up sulfur in a form plant roots cannot easily absorb. So even if your soil contains sulfur, your pepper plant may not be able to reach it. When you add Epsom salt, you are delivering sulfur as sulfate, which is the exact form pepper roots can pull in immediately with no conversion needed. That is why pepper plants treated for a real magnesium and sulfur shortage do not just grow bigger, they grow tastier. The peppers develop thicker walls, deeper color, and a fuller flavor because the plant is finally building the proteins and oils it was starved of. I remember the first time I tasted a bell pepper grown in soil that had been fed this way for 2 seasons running. A woman in Lancaster County handed me a thick ring of it off the cutting board without a word. I bit into it and stopped chewing for a second because I had never tasted a bell pepper that sweet in my life. It tasted like fruit. She just nodded and said, "That is what a pepper is supposed to taste like. That is the version your grandmother used to eat." The application schedule matters here because more is not better, and I want to be clear about that so you do not hurt your plants. You do not dump a whole cup of Epsom salt on one plant. That builds up salt in the root zone and damages it. The correct schedule is this: 1 to 2 tablespoons at planting time in the hole. Then, once flowering begins, a foliar spray every 2 weeks at 1 tablespoon per gallon of water. As the plant grows taller, you can also work about 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt per foot of plant height into the soil around the base every 6 weeks or so. That is the whole protocol. It costs almost nothing. It takes about 2 minutes per plant. And where a genuine magnesium shortage was holding the plant back, the result is a pepper plant that produces far more fruit than it did before, with thicker walls, deeper color, and a flavor that will ruin grocery store peppers for you. Now, if you already own a house with a garden bed that has been in the same spot for 10 or 15 years, and you are thinking this only applies to people starting fresh, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you, and it is the part I most wish someone had explained to me decades ago. Most established garden beds, the kind planted in the same place year after year, are magnesium depleted in ways the gardener never realizes is even happening. Think about it this way. Every single pepper you ever harvested out of that bed carried magnesium away with it when it left your garden and went into your kitchen. Every tomato did the same. Every cucumber, every leaf you raked up in the fall and tossed on a compost pile across the yard that you never carried back to that exact bed. Year after year, harvest after harvest, you have been quietly mining your own soil, pulling the minerals out a little at a time and carrying them away, and unless you have been deliberately putting magnesium back, that soil is now running on fumes. Nobody warned you, because there was nobody standing in your garden whose job it was to warn you. This is the real reason so many people will tell you their garden used to be wonderfully productive 20 years ago and now gives them less and less every single season. It is not always the weather, it is not bad luck, it is not that you have lost your touch. Very often it is simple mineral exhaustion, a slow bleeding out of the soil that happens so gradually you never saw it. And the fix is so cheap and so simple it is almost insulting. For an established bed, before the season starts, scatter about 1 cup of Epsom salt evenly across every 10 feet of pepper row. Take a hard rake and scratch it into the top 2 inches of soil. Then water the bed thoroughly so the crystals dissolve and begin working their way down toward the root zone. Do this in early spring, a couple of weeks before you plant. And if the season is already underway, if your peppers are already in the ground and standing there looking sad and yellow and stalled, you can still rescue them. Dissolve 2 tablespoons of Epsom salt into a gallon of warm water. Stir it until it is fully dissolved and pour it slowly around the base of each plant, 1 gallon per plant. 2 weeks after that, follow up with a foliar spray at 1 tablespoon per gallon sprayed right on the leaves. If a magnesium shortage was the thing holding those plants back, and in an old bed it very often is, you will see fresh new growth within a couple of weeks. The yellowing between the veins will begin to fade back to green, and the blossoms will start holding on instead of dropping to the ground. I watched this happen with my own eyes on a back porch in Ohio with 3 sad little jalapeno plants that the grandmother of the house had already decided to pull out and replace because she had written them off as a lost cause. She put a handful of bitter salt around the base of each one, watered them in well, and walked away. 3 weeks later, those same 3 plants she had given up on were producing more jalapenos than her family could eat fresh, and she was putting up the extras. She just shrugged at me and said, "The soil was hungry, we fed it." That is the entire mindset right there in 5 words. You are not buying fertilizer. You are feeding the soil what it actually lacks, instead of what a marketing department has decided to sell you. There is one more layer here that almost nobody talks about, and it has to do with combining Epsom salt with 2 things you already have in your kitchen. The Amish families I learned from did not use bitter salt all by itself. They used it as part of a 3-part feeding they simply called the kitchen mix, because every ingredient came from a working farm kitchen. The 3 parts are Epsom salt, clean hardwood ash from the wood stove, and crushed eggshells. The wood ash provides potassium, which matters for flower and fruit development. The eggshells provide calcium, which helps prevent the blossom end rot that ruins more peppers and tomatoes than any pest. And the Epsom salt provides the magnesium and sulfur that let the plant actually use the calcium and potassium properly. The recipe is simple. For each pepper plant, mix 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt, 2 tablespoons of finely crushed eggshells, and 1 tablespoon of clean hardwood ash. Stir it together, drop it into the planting hole, cover with a thin layer of soil, and plant your seedling on top. Now I have to give you 2 warnings on the wood ash, because they matter. First, it must be from hardwood like oak, maple, hickory, or ash, and from a clean fire only. Never use ash from a fire where trash, printed cardboard, or treated lumber was burned, because those contaminants will poison your soil. Second, wood ash is alkaline, which means it raises soil pH, and peppers like their soil slightly on the acidic side. The small amount in this recipe will not swing your pH much. But if you start dumping cups of ash on every plant every year, you will eventually push the soil too alkaline and your peppers will stop producing. Moderation is the whole game with ash. So, before I give you the last piece, the one I tracked down in an old agricultural archive that almost no gardening magazine will ever mention, here is where everything I have gathered from these Amish farms lives in one place. Every method, every measurement, every recipe from this channel is collected together in the description below in something called the Amish Home System. Now stay right here, because this final technique is the one that separates a good harvest from the kind of harvest that makes your neighbors stop their car at the end of your driveway. It came out of an Ohio State University extension bulletin published in 1957, back when American farmers were still leaning on knowledge passed down from the German and Swiss immigrants who settled across Pennsylvania and Ohio. The bulletin was written by a soil scientist who had spent years studying why certain Amish and Mennonite farms consistently outproduced their English neighbors using almost no store-bought inputs. He documented dozens of techniques, but the one that stopped me cold he called the warm water priming protocol. Here it is. The night before you plant your pepper seedlings into the ground, dissolve 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt into 1 gallon of warm water, about the temperature of a comfortable bath, warm to the touch, but never hot. Set your seedlings, still sitting in their little starter pots, into a shallow tray. Pour the warm Epsom solution into the tray until the water reaches about halfway up the side of each pot, so the bottom half of the root ball is sitting in it. Leave them there overnight, 8 to 10 hours, while you sleep. What happens in that time is quietly remarkable, and it happens down at the level of the individual root hair where you cannot see it. The roots, sensing the magnesium and the sulfur dissolved in that warm water all around them, begin actively drawing both minerals up through every root hair, hour after hour through the night. They are not waiting passively, they are pulling the minerals in and loading them into the plant's tissues. By morning, those seedlings have preloaded their entire root systems with the exact 2 minerals they will need to take off the instant they hit real soil, and the gentle warmth of the water has eased them out of the worst of their transplant shock before they are ever moved. They wake up primed and ready instead of stunned and struggling. And when you then take those primed seedlings and set them down into a planting hole that already holds the kitchen mix at the bottom, the Epsom salt and the eggshell and the wood ash, you have stacked one real advantage right on top of another. You have fed the hole and you have charged the plant, and the two work together. That 1957 bulletin documented pepper yields from primed seedlings that ran well above the yields from unprimed seedlings grown in the very same soil, with the same water and the same weather, the only difference being that one night of soaking. And then the technique quietly faded out of American gardening literature, disappearing across the same years that commercial fertilizer companies came to fund a great deal of the country's agricultural extension publishing. The soil scientist who wrote it retired, and his work was never reprinted, and a thing that should have belonged to every gardener in the country slipped out of the books entirely. But the Amish families I sat with had never needed the bulletin. They were doing the very same thing in their own plain words. One of them called it waking the roots, another called it the night soak. The grandmother in Ohio simply called it giving the plants their breakfast the night before they go to work. Picture what that actually means for you. For about 20 cents worth of Epsom salt, a little warm water from your own tap, and one single night of patience, you can turn an ordinary pepper seedling into a plant that carries fruit all the way through to the first hard frost of autumn. There is no special equipment to buy, there is no expensive product. There is a tray, some warm water, 2 spoonfuls of bitter salt, and the simple willingness to do one small thing the evening before you plant, instead of rushing the seedlings into the ground cold. And it does not matter in the slightest where those seedlings came from. You can do it with peppers you grew yourself from seed on the kitchen windowsill, or with seedlings you bought off a roadside stand this very morning on the drive home. The plant does not know and does not care about its history. It only knows whether it got its breakfast the night before. Now let me give you the deeper history, because the more you understand the full picture, the better your results will be, season after season, for the rest of the years you spend with your hands in the dirt. That spring in Epsom, England, in 1618, where the cattle would not drink the bitter water, was only the very beginning of the story. By the early 1700s, English gardeners had quietly figured out something the doctors selling the salt as medicine had completely missed. They noticed that when the bath water that had been used to soak sore feet and aching joints was carried out and poured onto the rose bushes and the vegetable beds, instead of being dumped down a drain, the plants in those beds grew thicker, greener, and bore more flowers and more fruit than the plants that got plain water. They had stumbled onto it sideways. There are old gardening journals describing gardeners then deliberately dissolving Epsom crystals into their watering cans and applying the solution to peppers, melons, and tomatoes, the new and exciting plants being brought back from the New World. They had no chemistry whatsoever to explain why it worked. They simply observed that it did, season after season, and they kept doing it. And that hands-on knowledge crossed the Atlantic with the colonists and became standard practice for every serious American gardener, from the tobacco farms of Virginia to the Pennsylvania Dutch homesteads to the kitchen gardens of New England. Thomas Jefferson himself kept detailed records of his pepper experiments at Monticello in the early 1800s, and his garden notes describe feeding his pepper plants with mineral solutions and watching the fruiting branches respond with fresh vigor. That was almost certainly the very same bitter salt, just under a different name, because the chemistry to name it properly did not exist yet. For 200 years, this was simply common knowledge, the kind of thing every gardening grandmother knew and passed to her daughter. Then, in 1909, a German chemist named Fritz Haber worked out how to pull nitrogen straight out of the air and synthesize it into ammonia, and within about a decade, the modern fertilizer industry as we know it was born. And almost overnight, soil went from being something you fed yourself with compost and manure and wood ash and mineral salts you gathered with your own hands, to something you bought solutions for in bags from companies with names you would come to know. And those companies had no earthly interest in promoting a plain mineral that any family could buy for $1.50 at the corner pharmacy. There was no profit in it. They wanted you buying their proprietary blends, their patented formulations, their slow-release pellets with the trademark names. So magnesium got quietly trimmed out of most commercial fertilizers, or left in only as a token trace, because magnesium sulfate was cheap, generic, unpatentable, and impossible to brand. By the 1950s, when the lawn and garden industry exploded out across suburban America, an entire generation of brand new homeowners was being taught by television commercials and glossy magazine ads that gardening simply meant driving to the store and buying the right product. The grandparents who still knew about bitter salt were passing on one by one, and their knowledge was not being handed down because their grandchildren were being told the old ways were primitive and the new ways were scientific. It was one of the quietest erasures in the whole history of American gardening, and almost nobody noticed it happening while it happened. And I want to leave you with the most important truth of all, the one that keeps this honest. Epsom salt is not a substitute for healthy soil. It is a key that unlocks soil that is already alive. If your dirt is dead, compacted, and drained of organic matter, magnesium alone will not save it. You still need compost. You still need earthworms. You still need the leaf mold, the aged manure, the cover crops turned under in fall, the mulch that holds moisture through the heat of July. Epsom salt works because it removes the single most common bottleneck in otherwise decent soil. It is the missing piece, not the whole puzzle. The grandmothers in those Pennsylvania kitchens and Ohio farmhouses did not just throw bitter salt around. They built their soil for decades, layer by layer, with kitchen scraps and chicken bedding and oak leaves raked from the woods behind the barn. The Epsom salt was the finishing touch on a foundation built with patience. So here is what I want you to do. Do not take my word for any of it. Try it on one plant this season, just one. Set aside a single pepper plant and give it the full treatment, the planting hole mix, the warm water priming the night before, the foliar spray every 2 weeks, the side dressing every 6 weeks. Leave your other plants the way you have always grown them. Then compare them at the end of the season. The plant will tell you the truth in the only language a plant speaks, which is the weight of the fruit hanging off its branches in September. Now, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments, because this audience tends to read and watch but not speak up, and your answer might be exactly what helps the next person. Have you ever used Epsom salt in your garden before, and did anyone ever tell you it was the warm water priming the night before planting that unlocks the real effect? Leave a comment with one word, peppers, just so I know you made it to the end. And if something here felt like it was given back to you, something that should have been yours all along, subscribe and stay with us, because the next video is about a single ingredient the Amish grandmothers in Holmes County work into their tomato beds in late June that grows tomatoes so heavy the vines have to be tied to posts to keep them from snapping. It is not Epsom salt. It is something even cheaper, and almost everyone in America already has it in the pantry right now without knowing what it does. Take care of your soil, take care of your family, and remember, the real wealth was never in the bag at the store. It was always in the dirt under your feet, waiting for someone to remember how to feed it. I will see you in the next one.